Welcome, friends, to another episode of the Positive Change Podcast, a podcast that's focused on inspiring uncommon and different thinking and really encouraging and inviting you to make positive change for yourself, those around you, and the world at large. I'm your host, Dr. Richard Harmer, and in this particular episode of the Positive Change Podcast, we're talking about the futures, and more specifically, what excites me and frightens me about what might be coming next. So listen in. Hi, I'm Dr. Richard Harmer, and you're about to discover new ways to go from overwhelm to thriving in your business and in your life by following your passions, pursuing your unique life purpose, and stepping fully into your infinite potential. You deserve to live your best life, a life filled with all of the clarity, courage, and commitment you need to be happy and to make a positive impact on the world. So get ready, because this podcast challenges society's expectations for what it means to be successful in life and in business, and invites you to grow beyond outdated assumptions for defining who you are. Welcome to the Positive Change Podcast. Welcome back to another episode of the Positive Change Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Richard Harmer, and in this particular episode, I'm answering a question from one of my clients that's about the futures. And the question is, what excites and frightens me about the future? In the words of Jim Dator, a futurist who spoke about 3 myths about the future, he did say one of his first myths is there's no such thing as the future. The future does not exist and cannot be predicted. I mean, he speaks about this in a way because he says there's no such thing as a singular future. There are futures, plural. There is a range of potential futures, infinite potentials of futures, and the decisions we make today make more futures more likely and other futures less likely. So when I think about this idea, what excites and frightens me about the future, then the first thing that comes to mind to me is, well, there's actually no future, there's futures. So which futures excite and frighten me? Which are those ones that have a positive or an enticing momentum or trajectory for me, and those which I feel slightly repelled by that actually might be important for us to consider? Because the real challenge here about thinking about the futures is we can't just focus on the ones that feel good. We have to be thinking about those ones that might not be feeling so good too, as a way of fully getting the repertoire of what might be possible and what wildcards might disrupt us so we can know how to work with them. So that is my first thought. And the second thought when I think about what excites and frightens me about the futures is also to recognize that the future has already happened in a way, because the past and what we've done already determines how our today is. The decisions we made decades ago, for example, around how we thought about the ozone layer and CO2 and carbon emissions decades ago, is currently impacting how we're experiencing climate and extreme weather conditions today. The decisions of the past determine our experience of the present. And therefore, the decisions of today will determine the futures that we experience. The future that we're going to experience is hidden in the patterns of our behaviors of today. The past, the present, and our potential are all interwoven into this very moment. So what we do now, what excites us and frightens us now, will have a significant impact on the futures we will more likely or less likely to experience. Having said that, also need to think about, as I start to unpack this question about what excites and frightens me about the futures, is the futures are many, and the futures are both personal, that is individually orientated, what's my future, or what are my futures, and collective, what are our futures, what are society's or humanity's futures. So maybe the place to start is to think about the collective futures first, and then come back to what that might mean for me personally and what excites and frightens me about that at an individual level. So one of the fundamental things that we can think about when we think about futures is what's called the PESTLE framework. A PESTLE is an allegory, I think it's called, where PESTLE stands for P is for political, E is for economic, S is for social, T is for technology, L is for legal or regulatory, and E, again, is for the environment. And if we think about these are the significant human level systems that we are working with. What are the political environments globally, the economic environment or situation globally, the social conditions, the technological advancements globally, the legislative or regulatory or legal environment globally, and the environmental conditions globally. This is the big picture stuff. And each of these we can think about as a past, a present, and a future, or past, present, potential. Let's look at the political landscape first globally and what that seems to be doing and what that might mean. Well, politically, there appears to be an increasing, based on geographical sovereign states, an increasing polarization of our political systems, particularly in many parts of the world who have a two-party preferred system, say in democratic societies. But politically, we are working more and more to some extreme conservatism, extreme libertarianism at the same time. So politically, there's greater polarization and increasing inability to find middle ground. Now, you can't consider political landscape globally without thinking about certain parts of the world. And we've got geopolitical wars occurring at the moment out of the Ukraine and parts of the Middle East and other parts of the world, including political instability even within countries. If you think about what's occurring in the US right now, there's political polarization between the extremes of the Republican movement and the Democratic movement, and similar applies in other two-party systems in the world, including in some parts, or recently in Australia, less so at the moment with our change in political party in the last federal election. But still, political polarization and inability to find middle ground and consensus to work with is really problematic at times, and is going to be really an issue because some of the global issues we're dealing with, particularly in some of these other elements of PESTLE, require a globally unified approach, which is very difficult with sovereign states with disparate political systems. The economic environment. I think we're really coming towards the end of endless or an understanding of limitless growth of our economies. There are some real constraints coming from some of these other parts of PESTLE coming through, particularly the environment, that is really saying to call into question, well, how can we continue to have endless growth when we have scarce resources? And that sort of leads to what is driving our economy at the moment feels more towards not an illusion of abundance, when reality is at a resource level is scarcer, but actually a scarcity within the economies where the 1% of the richest people in the world own 80% of the world's wealth. That scarcity, that ability, the inequality of our economic system is really creating extremes of wealth and extremes of poverty, where the world's middle class is really stretched in two directions, trying to sustain an economic stability where extreme poverty, the gap between the haves and the have-nots is really expanding or becoming more divided. This is something I think economically again at a global level we really need to be thinking about. There are some significant opportunities for how we think about a resetting of our economic systems. Capitalism is one example, and some of the work of capitalism 3.0 and 4.0 that is sort of trying to work through how do we have a more democratized version of how wealth is distributed globally. It's not really my area that I'm working in, but really fascinating how there's a lot of people working in this space right now trying to understand how do we bridge the gap between the haves and the have-nots and a resetting of our economic systems in this way. This leads us to the social element of, again, the haves and have-nots. Those people, not just economically, but socially, are in situations of inequality and a lack of a valuing of diversity in our social environments. You can look at that within many countries within the world, and even communities within countries, where the social statusing of the haves and the have-nots, the privileged, the less privileged, the inequality and the inequity that's occurring at a social level is really starting to be challenging on many fronts. And that ideological difference and you can see a trend here. I'm showing like polarities and distinctions here that make it really challenging to have a thriving society. A thriving society needs and requires all elements of our society to have an equal opportunity for choice. Self-determination is, in psychological terms, is what I'm referring to here, is the ability to choose one's own destiny. If socially we're unable to do that because of social norms that preference patriarchal over matriarchal societies, or even a way of understanding that, is really, there's some significant opportunities. And I think we've made some wonderful progress in this space, particularly in the last few years around gender and equality. Same-sex marriage, for example. But there is a lot of work to do in this particular space, and Australia is no different, particularly when we think about our Indigenous peoples, our First Nations peoples, and how we work with reconciliation in that front. That moves us on to technology, the T of PESTLE. I tell you what, there are some radical accelerations in technological advancements, particularly in the last decade. And I think I was reading somewhere just the week before last, maybe it was a little further back than that the singularity, a point in time where artificial intelligence becomes as intelligent as human intelligence. The singularity, 2042 from memory, that's 15 plus years away. That's actually not a long time when we think about the technological advancements that will occur, that to even have a likelihood that artificial intelligence will be able to think like a human and do so more effectively and efficiently is mind-blowing. What's going to be happening. We can't even comprehend what's occurring in that space. But again, there'll be some ethical considerations there. Many of our leading technologists in the globe are saying we should really be thinking about the ethical ramifications of artificial intelligence accelerating its intelligence faster than human beings. There's something to really be thinking about there, which I'll get to in the next element of legislative. But the real challenge, I think, of technology is, yes, there's definitely improvements around efficiency and automation, but the depersonalization and, in essence, the curation of our experience based on algorithms is going to result in this really. I think the danger here is that we miss out on living life or experiencing life fully because, one, it's so complex we can't comprehend it all, which comes back to development I've spoken about in a previous podcast. But actually, technology curating what we see in a way that continues to feed back to us what we've already liked means we're getting more and more and more polarized. And you can see this in our political system and our social structures, even more polarized because we're just getting more of what we like rather than what we need to see. And technology has a lot to answer for, particularly in social media in this particular space. The pursuit of mass personalization, which ultimately becomes even more depersonalized, is, I think, something that's a rise for concern. That leads us to the legislative, the regulatory and the legal environment. The creation of laws to protect us from all these other things. Well, I think the real challenge here, because you've got political parties involved in our legal and legislative system, is that sort of separation between church, state, and the law is really fascinating at the moment. Again, because we need global laws to deal with global challenges, and laws are created at a sovereign level. That is going to be very fascinating to work with, because fundamentally our legal system, in the way it operates in enacting things into law, and then the precedents created around those laws, takes a long time to establish how the law gets interpreted, and some other elements of our situation, technology or environment, require things to happen a lot faster than that. Finally, the environment. This is a podcast topic in and of itself. The fundamental collapsing of our environmental systems, extreme weather conditions, food and water shortages, the inability for our soils to maintain its vibrancy and killing our own soil, erosion, so many factors in our environment based on climate change is a significant cause for concern. And if I think about that factor as it relates to future generations, wow, they're going to have some hard work to deal with some of the decisions that we've previously made and continue to make that make it really challenging for our environment to look after itself, because we as a human species certainly are not. Okay, so on that note, just unpacking just some thoughts around PESTLE, you can see here that it seems a little doom and gloom as I read it through. And maybe that's true, and maybe that's just my own lens at the moment that is a cause for concern. Because what really strikes me as I come back to this question, what excites and frightens me about the futures is this sense of polarity of what's good or positive or exciting or attractive or enticing, and what's negative or fearful or to be avoided. That polarity forces like a half view of reality. Like the true element of what I've just shared around PESTLE is that there are as many good things happening around political environment, economic environment, the social, the technological, the legislative, and the environment itself. There are many good things happening as well as not. It's what is presented to us through where we get information and knowledge and data from. What really strikes me as I share this is how important it is to not play small at the moment, to live life fully, to live with love and a degree of abandon and abundance at the moment, because there are many things to have us feel fearful about the future. And I'm going to get to the technology, the one that's really I've been thinking a lot about in a moment. But there's a lot to be grateful for and a lot to be excited by when we think about the futures and what's possible. And I'm going to end this podcast in what I think is what's possible here. But there is lots to be considered. And that brings me to really thinking about technology in a bit more depth. The significant impact technology tends to be a leader, leading some of these other elements of PESTLE. Like we wouldn't necessarily need to enact a new law around social media regulation if we didn't have such a social media bonanza in the last 5 to 10 years, really driving how we consume news and information. And the alternative facts. This, as we enter into at a social level, the more pluralist society where there's no objective reality. The reality is co-created and constructed. The more we get alternative facts and multiple versions of the truth, and this pluralist nature makes it really hard to navigate who's right. Well, we're all right, and who's wrong? Well, we're all wrong. And how does that actually play out? And technology is playing that through its algorithm and how it feeds information to us. If I just think about social media, but even technology around automation in many organizational contexts, the future of medicine and healthcare, and working with people living longer and so on and so forth. So the real challenge that I see of technology is a dehumanizing of our experience at scale. If we think about the industrial revolution, starting from the first one mechanical, the second being electrification, the third being automation, fourth globalization, and digitization now, this sort of fourth and fifth industrial revolution of globalization and digitization. What we're really exploring here is that we're all data points that allow machine learning to learn more about the collective patterns of behavior as a way of then one side supporting us to make more effective decision making, and the other side helping us know telling us what we need to buy at what time. So there's the technology and big data and the Internet of Things, where everything is inverted commas smart to a degree, allows for a significant level of consumer comfort, but consumerism nonetheless. And that leads me to what I think is coming next, which is really exciting, is from digitization, that extreme of the dehumanization of things, the technology of things, is a return to personalization. This element of making and supporting the individual human to become more authentic and more intimate with ourselves. This sort of sense of personalization of things. So, for example, at scale, this might result in some really interesting work around circular economy, where big businesses, those polluters in our society, are personally responsible for addressing and redressing the environmental carnage that is being created. Rather than them organisations being immune to these things, it's actually now becoming a personal, individualized, at scale consideration of, you did this, therefore you need to pay that. This element of creativity and bespoke creativity or bespoke personalization of scale, everything from DNA-driven drugs to support diseases, through to curated and supported relationships based on psychological needs. This personalization at scale is significantly fascinating and exciting, I think, for the future of humanity. And I was just reading the other day about we're entering the next renaissance. The last renaissance being, this bringing together of politics and art and humanity in a mixing pot. And this next phase of our renaissance of humanism, coupled with purpose, coupled with inclusivity, creativity, and a degree of being a global citizen, not just a country citizen, but a global citizenship, is really, really interesting. I think this personalization at scale, as we move beyond technology driving decisions to people driving decisions about technology, I think is really fascinating and fills me with excitement and hope. Because, to be honest, at a very individual level, the future is looking pretty bright for a psychologist, right? Because anything that's around empathy and care and deep self and other understanding and a willingness and a desire to be more intimate and authentic with each other, that's what I love to do, and that's what I'm really excited about. When we move beyond people as resources to people as humans, and the connectedness and what we can discover from each other as we pursue our humanness together, that fills me with excitement about the potential of our futures. All we need to do is overcome the real problems of today to get there. And that means really at a global level coming together around our political landscape, economic goals, social priorities, and a sense of health and happiness and well-being for everybody, and inclusivity for everybody, technological advancements that serve a human benefit, not a commercial outcome, or not just a commercial outcome, legislative creation that is ethically sound, politically neutral and supportive of everybody, and the environment, really working hard to work that bit out. That's something that is essential for us to be working on now, because the ticking time bomb is pretty close, 4 minutes to midnight type stuff. So we really need to be working in this space. So perhaps a reflection from this particular podcast is recognizing that the future hasn't yet been created. The futures are possible, and we make choices today that make some futures more possible than others. And so it's the choices you make, the choices I make, and the choices we make together that create the futures we are more likely to experience. What choices are you making today to create the futures you most want to experience in the future? Until next time, see you soon.
Hi, and thank you so much for checking out another episode of the Positive Change Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please hit subscribe using the button below, and make sure you also click the bell icon to get notified every time we release a new episode. If you're looking for the show notes for this episode, we have them in the link underneath. as well as our social media handles and some links to free training and other offers that we drop from time to time to help you go from overwhelmed to thriving in pursuing your best life. So go ahead and check out this episode's show notes if you're interested. And thank you so much for tuning into the Positive Change Podcast.